About a year ago, I was working with an agency on a website build. That project included a component or section that the designer called a drop image. Basically, the text sits to the left and there's an image to the right. Now, normally that's not a big deal, but in this particular case, the image also extends beyond the height of the section, vertically speaking. It took a little bit of trial and error, but the result was exactly what the designer was after. So I thought I'd share how I did it. Okay, so here we are in CodePen with this demo. We're going to build out that section that I talked about earlier. And just so you know that the link to the final demo will be in the description below. Okay, so as you can imagine, like with any modern website these days, this component and the entire website really had to be responsive. So because of that, we're going to go ahead and shrink our viewport down so that it is, kind of small, mobile-ish. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bunch of CSS that isn't really required for the actual component that we're building out, but rather for the layout and the navigation and all that. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in there, and you can see that we have our fonts and everything just kind of, it looks kind of nice, right? But it's not quite done. So if we take a look at the HTML, we have our nav up here, and I'm not going to go into detail. You can check that out on your own. And then we have our hero section or component. And then below that, we have this other section that I've given a class name of full. And that's what's going to tuck underneath that image because it's going to be butted up right next to the hero. And so you'll see what I mean once we start coding. So I'm going to actually go ahead and I'm going to collapse this so that we can just see these are our three main sections or what have you. So I'm going to open this back up and collapse this. So let's start with the hero. So we're going to go into the hero and we're just going to go ahead and give it a background color. Now, if we scroll down a bit, you can see that I've set a couple of custom properties so that we're not having to type out the hex color for red or yellow over and over again. So for the background color, we're going to set that to var red, and we're going to set the text color to white. Okay, great. So now we're going to move on to the actual container. So let's go hero container. And the reason I'm going hero container is because if I just did container, it would also affect the navigation. So we want to be specific there. And for this, we want to do display grid. And then we want to set the width to 100%, which doesn't really do anything right now because it by default is going to go to 100%. But you can see that we've got some gaps here just based on what our container class does, which if we scroll down is right here. So you can see that we're setting a minimum, an ideal, and a maximum width using the clamp function inside of CSS. And then we're just centering it with a margin inline auto. Okay, so so far, it's looking okay. We're getting closer. So the next thing we want to do is actually open this up and see, okay, we want to go and work with the content. Now, the reason I keep closing, collapsing and uncollapsing or closing and opening these things in the HTML is just because it makes it a little bit easier to see what I'm working on. And this is actually very much or very similar to how I work on actual real projects. So now we're going to go in and we're going to focus on the content. So we're going to go hero content. Now in this case, I don't have to put the hero in front, but I'm choosing to do so just to be consistent because that's typically how I write CSS. So we're going to go ahead and change the font weight here to about 200. And we're going to set the order to 2. And the reason for that is because I didn't mock this up, but in the actual project, the designer did make it so that when it's mobile, when it's below a certain breakpoint, the text would sit below the image. And so that's why we're choosing order 2. Because we have it set to display grid, and by it I mean container, we have it set to display grid, and in the HTML we have the content coming first and the image coming second, we actually want to switch that around without changing the markup. So we're setting the order to 2 here. Then I'm going to go ahead and add some padding, left and right padding, which is padding inline is the same as doing padding left and padding right, but it's just a shorthand. So we'll do 3 VW, which stands for viewport width, and then we'll do padding block, which is the same as padding top and bottom, and we'll do 3 rem. All right, so that's looking pretty good. So the next thing is that we want to start working on the image a little bit. So we'll go hero and then image. And we're just going to go ahead and do padding inline start. What that means is basically padding left and then 3 VW. Again, this is what the designer of the original project had in mind, keeping that little bit of space on the left hand side there. All right, so now we're actually going to go ahead and work with the image. We'll come back to the content in a little bit, but we're going to go ahead and go like so, hero img, and we're going to give this a border bottom left radius of 50 pixels. And we're going to make sure that the image spans 100%. So we're going to give it a width of 100%. All right, so it's starting to look pretty nice there. And now we're going to go ahead and jump down to this full section. And I just want to, actually, I'm going to skip that for now. We'll come back to it. All right, so now this looks pretty good. We can see that we have the container that isn't quite right because we still have this gap. So what we want to do is come back up here and actually let's take a look at what we have here. Container, we're giving it, let's see. Let's go ahead and change this to 100 VW. And that should give us more. I think we're missing something here. So let's see here. Okay, so the issue is actually with the body. So we need to head over to the body tag here and give it a margin of 0. And so that makes sure that we get rid of those little gaps on the left and right hand side. So as far as mobile goes, this looks good and we're pretty much done. So now it's a matter of making sure that we have the layout correct for larger screens. Now for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and use a media query just because we don't need to use a container query. A media query will work just fine here. And I'm actually going to set this to width greater than or equal to 1024. So now we're going to go into the container again. So we'll go hero container. And I believe that's already set to display grid, so we don't have to rewrite that, but we do want to set the grid template columns. So we'll do a repeat of 12, and then we'll do, instead of 1 FR or 1 fraction, we'll do a min max of 0 and then 1 fraction. All right, so that's giving us the minimum and the maximum for the column width. All right, so then we're going to set the container to a max width of 91 rem, and we're pulling this basically from, let me collapse this. We're pulling this from right here. This is our max width, and so we're grabbing that and just sticking in here. All right, so then we have, we want to align the items center, and then we're going to go ahead and give this a min height of, a min height of 500 pixels. All right, now you can see that nothing is really going on here, and the reason for that is because we haven't hit 1024 pixels yet. But there we go. So now that I've expanded that, you can see that we have something. It's not quite ready to, for prime time yet, but we're getting there. All right, so the next thing we want to work on is the content, right? So let's go ahead and do hero.content. And now we're going to flip the order back. Remember earlier we did an order 2 on the content. Now we want to flip it back to order 1. So that's going to move it off to the left, or at least it's supposed to. But I think the reason that it's not is because the hero image isn't set that way. So we're going to go ahead and add hero image and set the order to 2. So now those are now flipped. Okay, so the reason that this is so narrow is because what we've done is we've basically set a column grid layout, like a column layout, using the grid template columns. So we're basically telling the browser, okay, set 12 columns and our content will fit in those columns. So the container itself has 12 columns, and this takes up one column, and the image takes up another column. So we need to be explicit about how many columns each one is going to take. So that's what we're going to work on next. So let's go back up to the hero content, and we're going to go to grid column, and this is where we tell the browser basically how many columns to use. And there are a couple different ways to do this, but I like to do it like so. So you go span 5, and that basically is telling the browser to use 5 columns. And just so that we're not hitting the edge too much, I'm going to add some padding over to the left. Now you could do padding left, but I like to do padding inline start, 1 VW. Now, the reason that I use padding inline, padding block, is because if you're ever working on a site that is in a language that is not right to left, or excuse me, that is not left to right, but is right to left, then that way you're not having to flip between padding left and padding right. Instead, you're using padding inline, and the browser knows what that really means. So you could padding inline start just isn't going to be left necessarily. It's going to be wherever the language starts. Okay, so now that we have got the content done, now let's move on to the image and get that showing up a little bit nicer. So we're going to do the same thing like we did here with the grid column. So we're going to go grid column, and this time we're going to set a span of 7. So it's going to take the rest of that, because 7 plus 5 is 12. So now we have all of our columns spoken for, basically. And the trick to getting this to work properly is to use absolute positioning on the actual image tag itself. But for the image div, what we want to do is give it a position relative. Otherwise, the absolute positioning won't work. So we'll do position relative, and we'll give it a height of 100%. All right, so that's looking pretty good. And now what we want to work on is the actual image tag itself, or the image itself, which is this right here. So we'll go hero img, and here's where we're going to do position absolute, and that completely takes it out of the flow. But we want to set the top to 0 just to be sure, and then we're going to do object fit cover. So this is kind of like when you set cover to a background image so that it fills up the whole container. That way it doesn't like get all stretched out. It's the same thing, except we're working on an actual image tag. Now, it's not really doing anything much right here because we actually need to set the width to 100% and the height. We could set it to 100%, but that just gives us the image to the edge. It just takes it to the edge, and we actually want to go below that. So what we're going to do, and this is where this actually gets taken care of. So we're going to do calc, which is one of my favorite functions in CSS. So we're going to do 100% plus 60 pixels. Now, back in the day, you would have to use JavaScript to get this to work, but now CSS with the calc function, this is super, super easy. So you can see what we're basically telling the browser to do is determine, okay, whatever this is, 100%, in our case, it's 500 pixels, but it could be anything. And then add 60 pixels to it so that the image drops below that. Now, the reason I say this height could be anything is because even though we've set it to 500 pixels, I believe we set it as a minimum height, which means that we can add any amount of content in here. So let's just, if we just duplicate this over and over and over again, it's going to expand the height of this right here. But you can see that the image still overlaps by 60 pixels. So that's why we use a minimum height, and that's why we're using the calc function, because we just don't know how much content there will ever be, because the client may be on a CMS, a content management system, and changing the content on a regular basis. So we want to give them that flexibility without breaking the layout. So really that's it. Like that's all you really need to do to get this to work. But like I mentioned earlier, there's this full section that we want to butt up against the previous section, this hero section, and have the image overlap from the top, right? So what we want to do is we want to go back up here to before our media query, and we're going to go dot full, and we're just going to set this to a background color, excuse me, a minimum height of another 500 pixels. And this is just random. We don't really need to do this, but this is just for demonstration. And then a background color of light gray. And that's just so you can see that this is hitting exactly like I said we should, where it's butting up against the actual section and then getting tucked underneath that image. But that's really it. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, like this video, and I'll see you in the next one.